Hello everyone, welcome to another video on the channel. Welcome to part 2 of our GT Sport versus other racing game series. If you haven't seen the first one of these, now the concept is very simple. Simply we take the same car and track combination, we equalise as many of the settings as we possibly can in terms of equipment used, tyre and fuel multipliers, time of day, conditions, field of view, the view that we're using, so cockpit view in both of them, and we simply try and narrow it down just to that driving experience. We do a couple of laps at each game, and I kind of discuss what I find different about the games, what I'm finding similar in terms of how the car handle and what you're feeling underneath the car, and then we wrap it up with a quick conclusion towards the end. So you can probably tell from the thumbnail and from the footage right here in front of you that part 2 of the series is going to be GT Sport versus Asseto Corsa Competizione. We're going to be using the PC version of ACC, and I'll explain the reasons for that once we kind of jump into that sim. And we are using the Mercedes AMG from 2016 in GT Sport. I think it's a 2015 model in ACC around Monza in Italy. So with all that said, let's jump into our AMG and GT Sport and do a couple of laps. Okay then, here we are then, let's jump into our Mercedes and do a couple of laps. Now you may well have noticed on the introduction there that the car had been sitting for a period of time, so the tyres had gone stone cold. So I've reset the lobby, or reset the start of the session. So we're going to brake just before the 100 metre board as we exit the pits here. Get into the first chicane. The tyre wear is only at ×1 here. We also have ABS on weak because I believe that kind of represents a better comparison for how braking works in GT Sport compared to other games. So we just have to be a little bit more careful with the brakes, particularly in these bigger braking zones, than you do on default. Oh, I don't think we've got that quite right, have we? So, cold tyres, cold brakes. Struggling to get the car stopped here for the second chicane. Maybe we did brake a little bit late. But yeah, the one thing that always gets me about GT Sport when I jump into it is just the weight of the car. I do love the way they simulate the weight of the car. Whether it's realistic or not, I don't know, but it just gives me, you know, I always find that, you know, very comforting to jump into GT Sport just purely through that weight of the car, and just it allows me just to kind of particularly in this kind of sort of dead zone bit, I find a lot of other sims struggle a little bit there to kind of convey the weight of the car. Again, I'm not talking about realism here, I'm just talking about comfort, if you like. So, still don't get these tyres quite warmed up. Here we come to the end of our kind of out lap here, and we're about to start our first lap as we come down towards Parabolica. So we're going to brake just around about the 100 metre board. Trying to get the car into that apex there, so you can feel the car loaded up nicely into Parabolica, as it should do. High speed corner, you should feel the car start to load up and try to pull to obviously the opposite direction that you are steering. So Gran Turismo Sport does simulate that. Maybe not as well as some other games, but it certainly does do the job. So come down towards turn number 1 here. I'm going to brake just before the 150 metre board because, again, those that weak ABS. Use a lot of curb on the inside. Avoid the sausage curb on the outside. A little bit oversteer on the exit. Using the rumble strip there on the exit as well. GT Sport does do rumble strips very nicely, but one thing Monza does kind of highlight is a big weakness of GT Sport, and that is that road feel. Obviously a lot of long straights here on Monza. One thing you can do in GT Sport is abuse these curbs like you wouldn't believe in the second chicane, and we're going to see that is not the case in ACC. So 50 metre board as we come into Lesmo 1, try and catch the camera on the inside, helps the car not to understeer quite as much, and the 50 metre board for Lesmo 2 as well. Again, using the rumble strip on the exit there, very nice to feel. But what I was going to say though is one of the big weaknesses of GT Sport is that road feel, and these long straights it's definitely do kind of highlight that kind of lack of feeling through the wheel as you're going down the straights. You're not really feeling too much in terms of bumps. Once you're in the corners you certainly feel the track underneath you a bit more, but again, coming onto this long straight here, down towards Parabolica, there's, you know, the weight of the car's there, but there's just not really anything going on in terms of the suspension or the bumps. Now what is very strange, and I'll highlight that at the end of the next lap, is that it would appear to be a bit of a game choice from GT Sport to not kind of give you that kind of feeling, and as I said, I shall highlight that towards the end of this next lap here. One thing though, I do notice though, I don't know why, but there is a big bump as you go over the start-finish line there in GT Sport. I'm going to be interested to see if you that's felt in ACC when we jump onto there. I'm going to brake a little bit later into turn number 1 this time. Just down into second gear. Again, you lose lots of curb on GT Sport, but you do have to avoid that sausage curb on the inside of the second part. Into Curva Grande once again. You feel the wheel start to load up here. Again, that's what it should be doing. Don't miss a gear, so we'll try to do too much commentary. Let's take the chicane properly this time. Let's avoid the curbs. I do wish GT Sport would kind of make you take some of these chicanes a little bit more accurately, if you like. There's a sort of similar problem with the last chicane at Catalonia as well, where you can just abuse the curbs just a little bit too much. Definitely something I'd like to see tightened up within GT Sport. Now, if you played GT Sport a long time ago, you would know that in some of these corners they used to have barrels to stop you from cutting the curbs too much. I don't know if they had them on Monza or the last chicane at Catalonia, but they definitely had them on the chicane at Suzuka, which is another chicane you can take a lot of liberties with. Now, this is what I want to highlight to you here. So, as I said, you know, there's no bumps here as you're going down these straights, but if you go wide at Parabolica, you come into this little bit of tarmac here. Now, for whatever reason, you really do feel the bumps here. It's actually really nice. You know, so it would be great if that feeling that you get there, where you're not actually on the track, you actually felt something similar to that when you were going down these long straights, just to kind of help with that immersion. But that's our laps finished in GT Sport. Let's take that information that we've learned there and move on to ACC and see what's similar and what is different. Here we are then on ACC. We're in our AMG GT3 Mercedes-Benz here. I don't think that's the right way to say the name, is it? But we've got a lovely man filter livery on here. Let's get into the cockpit view if we can find it, and let's get moving. So, obviously, exiting the pits here, just the same as we did on GT Sport. We're going to do 3 laps. We're going to talk about various things and how it compares to GT Sport. So we're going to look for the 100 metre braking board for braking out of the pits. That's where we broke in GT Sport, and looks like that works just fine on ACC as well. Now, let me just explain why we're using the PC version of ACC over the console version. It's been a lot easier for me just to use the console version. Now, I've done a lot of quite extensive testing between the PC and the console version, and in my opinion they are almost identical, particularly when it comes to that driving experience, you know, the handling and force feedback. I think they're absolutely the same. However, a lot of people out there don't think that, so I didn't want to kind of put this video together, then people coming in the comments and saying, oh, you should have used the PC version of ACC. I can't understand so much there. So this is the PC version of ACC. The problem for that, for me, that it should be fine, is that I don't have the strongest PC in the world. And as anyone will know, if you try and record gameplay, it can't impact your FPS. So, to be fair, the software we're using though is not too bad for being too stressful for recording. So hopefully, this is running fine, and it should be good. Anyway, let's with that said, let's now move on to sort of doing a couple of laps and then just talking about those differences between ACC and GT Sport when we kind of go back to back on the same combo. Now, the first thing that will strike you with ACC is that it's definitely trying to provide that much more visceral experience, you know, not just with the noise of the car, but everything's just more aggressive. The way the car, you know, the way that you feel the car on the track is a lot more aggressive. The bumps on the road, I actually is exactly what I'm looking for in GT Sport too. You know, you can really feel the bumps as you go down. You know, that road feel. I really wish That's how it felt on GT Sport. You know, as you come through Curva Grande here, you can feel the suspension working. With little bumps in the road. Annoyingly enough, is exactly what it kind of feels like in that little strip of tarmac just at the side of Parabolica and GT Sport. So the next big difference is this chicane here. You cannot take the curbs in anywhere near the same fashion as you can on GT Sport. In fact, you can barely touch the curbs at all. If you do touch the sausage curbs, it will launch the car into the air, almost like you're driving over the Dragon's Teeth in Germany in a Sherman tank. Not sure how realistic that is in ACC, but they will absolutely launch the car in quite a ridiculous fashion, in my opinion. But it does stop you from taking liberties with the curbs, so in that respect, it does the job. Now the car does feel quite a bit understeer right here compared to GT Sport. Now, a lot of people complain about understeering GT Sport, but this car is extremely understeery at the moment, particularly through Lesmo 1. Going into Parabolica for, well, the second time I guess, but the first time in an actual racing lap. So, in terms of how the car weights up, it's a difficult one. It's actually quite similar in a lot of ways the way the car weights up as you go through the high speed corners. But yeah, the weight of the car in GT Sport is just something that I've always preferred to anything else. In terms of coming into these big braking zones, I used the same braking marker there as I did in GT Sport. Forgot to go down to first gear there. The rumble strips don't feel as good on ACC compared to GT Sport, in my opinion. It doesn't feel quite as an authentic rumble. But yeah, you certainly feel them, that's for sure. And that kind of highlights something that I've always felt in ACC as well. That feeling of when you lose the back end of the car from the force feedback is so vague. You know, I've heard, some people think the force feedback's brilliant in ACC, and I've heard other people who, understeer. I've heard other people who seem to know what they're talking about when it comes to force feedback. They describe the force feedback in ACC as being very vague. Now, I think a lot of people maybe misinterpret what force feedback is, or maybe there is different ways of interpreting force feedback. For me, force feedback's job is to tell you what the car's doing in terms of understeer and oversteer. And they give you the feeling so you can then make the corrections. Yeah, this car, I think we've got damage on my car here, folks. But yeah, I do find when you lose the back end in ACC that it's so vague that there's just nothing coming through the wheel to tell you until it's too late. So that's I would definitely give that advantage to GT Sport. That is actually, I think the force feedback in GT Sport's excellent for communicating that kind of loss of grip on the car. Whether it be on traction as you come out of a corner, or under braking when the back end goes loose. GT Sport does communicate that very well, and I would say it does it better than ACC. But yeah, let's just come to a halt here now. I think we have learned enough. Now I did test the bump on the start-finish line there on one of the laps. I forgot to comment on it. Where it seems like a big bump in GT Sport. It's about the only bump you feel on the straight, admittedly. But it doesn't appear to be there on ACC, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, plenty more bumps on the road for ACC over at GT Sport. But yeah, let's move on to a quick conclusion. And so yeah, here is that conclusion. Now I'm going to spare you my mugshot for this part of the video, just to save your eyes a little bit if you've managed to make it this far, and also to actually save myself a little bit of time. Just do this straight on to the PlayStation 5 Share Factory. But an interesting little back-to-back comparison, I hope you would agree. It's a very, very interesting, the fact, there's like two completely different approaches here to kind of giving you the same experience. GT Sport is just an incredibly smooth experience overall. The track's a bit too smooth, but the visuals are very smooth and polished, the feedback's very smooth and polished, and yeah, it's an enjoyable kind of drive, you know, it's like almost you can kind of just relax almost while you're driving the car, whereas ACC on the other hand gives you this incredibly visceral and aggressive experience. You know, everything's bumpy, the curbs are incredibly unforgiving, you know, the camera's juddering about to kind of simulate that kind of aggressiveness within the car that you might feel. And yeah, as I said, you know, I think they're almost like polar opposites of each other, and I think somewhere maybe in the middle ground is actually the best, because, for example, taking the curbs at the second chicane, they're far too easy to abuse, they're far too forgiving in GT Sport, whereas in ACC they are so brutally unforgiving, and it's almost like driving over boulders. If you sort of accidentally hit them just ever so slightly, they throw you off the track. And yeah, so I think a kind of middle ground where you can't abuse them as much as you can in GT Sport, but they don't quite kill you quite so readily in ACC, would probably be the best bit. The other big difference was in the road feel. Much prefer the road feel in ACC with the bumps in the road and the suspension working. Just much more immersive experience compared to the road, which is far too smooth in GT Sport. And hopefully, as I kind of maybe showed you, that seems to be a little bit of a game choice on Polyphony Digital's part, because that kind of little bit of strip of tarmac, you know, go out and give it a wee go if you're playing GT Sport again. Have a wee drive over it. You'll feel the bumps coming through the wheel. You'll feel it's a really nice experience, and maybe you'll agree with me that it'd be nice to kind of have that sort of feel through the wheel as you were going up and down the straights in Monza, just to kind of add to that immersion. But in terms of how you kind of approach the corners, if we kind of break down each part of the track, turn 1 feels quite similar between both games in terms of braking zones and line and just how you take the car through the corner. Turn 2, well, with the chicane, quite different. Obviously you can abuse the curbs in GT Sport, but you can't in ACC. Lesmo 1, the car's very understeery in ACC compared to GT Sport. I noticed that lap after lap. Not sure why. It seems very odd the way the car just understeers all of a sudden, and there's not really a lot you can do about it. Maybe a setup issue on my part. I was just using the aggressive setup in ACC. Lesmo 2 felt very similar. Ascari felt quite similar as well. A little bit more tricky in ACC. You've got to give the curbs a little bit more respect. Much easier to lose that back end. That's one other thing I wanted to mention as well in terms of the force feedback. I don't like the way the back end loses grip in ACC, and there's like seems to be very, very little warning. I do think GT Sport handles force feedback and tell you what the car's doing just a little bit better, but that's possibly a controversial point. But yeah, all in all, an interesting little experiment. I hope you've agreed. If you do agree and you have enjoyed the video, please hit that like button, please hit that subscribe button. Let me know your thoughts and your comments, your criticisms, etc. in the comments below as well. I shall do my very best to reply to everyone. But yeah, thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one. Goodbye now.